Zambia struck a deal with bondholders this week. The move is expected to see the southern African country emerge from more than 3 years of defaulting on its debt. This could also be the first successful restructuring under the debt rework architecture designed by the G20. Earlier, political economist Yaduma Beniza joined me for a conversation on what this means for Lusaka. Let's take a look. Now, this debt restructuring has been welcomed by the Zambian president, also by institutions such as the World Bank. Take us through the restructure and how it is a step in the direction, if it is a step in the right direction.
It is a step in the right direction, mainly because this has been an ongoing process for the last 2 to 3 years where the government of Zambia has been trying to renegotiate for debt relief. Coming off of the challenge of COVID, obviously, it faced serious challenges with paying its debt and needed to get onto the G20 debt service suspension initiative, which was the predecessor to the current program where the government has reached an agreement. That program was supposed to end in December 2021, and it primarily paused the debt servicing costs for all governments that were applying for debt relief to the program. Although this did improve liquidity in some countries, it wasn't enough for Zambia. And Zambia needed a much more longer term approach, hence the restructuring. And so for the last 2 years, the government has really been struggling to negotiate with its creditors in two main committees, the private creditors committees, which involve private commercial banks, and the official creditors committee, which is made up of government or sovereign lending institutions represented by their governments. And they were able to reach an agreement on a memorandum of understanding in June 2023. And this really sketched out the main features of what the debt relief would look like. And it was then upon the government to reach the same comparable type of treatment or debt relief from its private creditors after it reached an agreement with the official creditors in June, and it is now a welcomed achievement, having reached the agreement with the private creditors and bondholders, that the government is in a position to get the debt relief that it needs. What this means is that now public debt is on a more sustainable trajectory. The government of Zambia should be able to make its payments. It is also going to get a 3-year grace period, along with the IMF program, which is supposed to give it fiscal room, and then to start repayments in 3 years' time, stretching the term over 20 years. Fortunately, the agreement also has a mid-term kind of check to see where the government is in order to avoid things like moral hazard in the case that the economy of Zambia recovers strongly and such that government acquires more debt. There is room to shift the agreement halfway through in order to minimize the extension and also the debt relief according to the debt carrying capacity of the government at the time.
With that wiggle room too, it really does sound like a step in the right direction. Now, as you've mentioned as well, it's been a long time coming. Also, when we're looking at recent history, just taking it a little bit further back to 2019, when Zambia faced challenges repaying its debts, including its Eurobonds. Take us through how Zambia got to that stage in the first place.
So really, Zambia, I think, has had a bit of a challenge since 2014 leading up to 2016 period, largely due to volatile copper prices. Copper is one of the key commodities that Zambia exports, and so the price of copper really affects how much the economy earns by way of foreign exchange, and also the strength of the Zambian kwacha. So in times when the copper prices are good, the economy earns a lot of dollars, and as such, the Zambian kwacha can appreciate. So what's happened in Zambia post 2016 was that the government was starting to face some challenges due to low copper prices, and was having challenges paying service providers and servicing its debt. At the time, they were in negotiations with the IMF for a support program, but they couldn't reach an agreement because the IMF had demands on the debt servicing and debt sustainability strategy of the government, which the government wasn't forthcoming at the time, according to the IMF. This then took them 2 years up until the point at which the government of Zambia really needed significant debt relief, but they still couldn't meet each other. And so by the time the COVID pandemic came in 2020, this was literally the last straw, supposedly, on the government of Zambia's back. Fortunately, in 2020 March, the G20, on the back of demands or requests from African governments, started the G20 Debt Service Suspension Initiative. And so it was on the back of that initiative then that the government of Zambia was able to request debt relief. What really seems to have gotten Zambia in the tight squeeze that it's in now is the issue of copper prices, but also from the period 2016 to about 2019, 2020, the government spending, particularly on capital projects, was not very tight. And so there were really some questionable expenditures and some expenditure which even the World Bank and IMF were questioning that seemingly has not been reported on or has been disappeared. So generally speaking, they didn't have strong public financial management, actually, which is what led them to over-borrowing too quickly, too soon, and when the copper prices deteriorated, they were in a position where they couldn't service that debt, which was acquired at a time when copper prices were much better in the period from 2012, 2014, leading up to 2016.
And fast forward to 2024, would you say, Sia, that they do have proper public financial management now and a leadership that will be able to then perhaps not even fault on these repayments as well? And how will it handle possible defaults?
So after the 2021 elections, where former President Edgar Lungu was replaced by incumbent President Hichilema, President Hichilema has really gone on a reform program to try and express firstly the political will that his government has to tie up fiscal management and public finances. They've really implemented a lot of reforms over the last 3 years. Obviously, the reforms themselves were not sufficient to take the government out of the challenging fiscal situation, and obviously this has then spread into the rest of the macroeconomy, as is illustrated by the significant depreciation of the kwacha on the back of investors losing confidence in government securities. So really where the government is now and where copper prices are, since 2021 there's been a significant improvement in copper prices. 2021 really was a boom for copper prices. They then went down in 2022, 2023. They're back up now at around $9,000 a metric ton, which is a good fortune for Zambia. What this means is that in addition to the fiscal reforms that President Hichilema has enacted since coming into power, the better copper prices mean that the government revenues will be improved slightly. As such, there will be some space, and the debt relief then comes in at a much needed time. And so it does provide relief on top of other reforms that the government itself has taken. And so the expectation is that the government should stick to the debt relief measures. And if there's no major economic shocks to things like the copper prices or other geo or global shocks, one expects that the government of Zambia should have sustainable public debt in the medium term. One of the key targets that the debt relief is going for is to reduce debt from where it's at. I think it's around over 120% of GDP to around 80% of GDP by 2027, and to reduce the debt servicing cost to around 15% of exports by 2027, which is the time at which the debt servicing then will resume after this 3-year grace period.
On this journey as well, it hasn't been an easy one. China, you mentioned earlier the commercial banks as well, but also countries' vested interests such as China has had quite a hard stance on Zambia's debt restructuring. What role did it play in this decision? Because in previous decisions, when it came to Zambia's debt restructuring, they weren't so lenient.
I think China does get a bit of a bad rep on its investments or lending to African governments. I think in the case of Zambia's debt relief, the Chinese involvement has actually been positive. So firstly, there are two things that's happening. One is obviously there's the geopolitical and global economic shifts where China influence is rising, and so China is actually one of the biggest creditors to the government of Zambia. And as such, negotiations obviously could not discount or ignore the voice or the influence of China in the negotiations. And the other thing is that the actual contribution of China has been positive in the debt relief negotiations, mainly as a representative of the so-called Global South. This has been a counterbalance to the dominant Western voices that dominate institutions such as the Paris Club and the G20. As a result, I think, of Chinese influence as well, apart from raising the global south perspective on the debt relief, China was actually able to introduce the mechanism to avoid a moral hazard, which is the halfway review process that I was talking about, which says halfway through the debt relief period, they will review the economic and fiscal situation, and if there's a significant improvement, they aim to then shorten the extension of 10 years. So currently, all the government debt has been extended by 20 years, and so with a 3-year grace period, meaning from 2027, 17 years forward, the government will then be able to amortize and pay off its debt. And halfway through, what China has recommended and has been taken up by the committees is that if conditions have improved significantly, what they will do is shorten that period to 15 years, which means the government of Zambia will be able to amortize its debt much quicker and not fall into the trap of borrowing further, given the further fiscal room that it's likely to have with the debt relief.
And I want to talk a bit more about that in terms of, that wiggle room that really will be welcomed and reducing those years as well. But speaking of different countries' roles as well, let's talk about France when it comes to this as well. What role did France play? And was it a hard role?
Yes, so I think France really was a central role. So the two chairs of the Official Creditors Committee were China and France as co-chairs. And really, as the chair of also the Paris Club Secretariat, the coordination was really being done primarily led by French officials in conjunction with the IMF. So the IMF would provide the kind of technical assistance, financial modeling of how the debt relief would work and what that means for creditors. And the coordination done by France through its national treasurer, I think, has been quite instrumental in guiding the process, but also being able to balance different forces.